Hey, welcome to the Launch podcast with me, Anthony Delaney. I'm grateful that you're joining us today. And I'm really excited that we have a special guest with us. As some of you might know, if you listen to the podcast or watch it, sometimes it's me bringing a thought about something. You're free to check them out. But I know that so many appreciate it when we get external perspectives, other people that are coming in, people that are friends or friends of friends, and people that I've connected with. Patrick's one of those. I've heard about him, kind of been in the same room as him, seen him at Spring Harvest and other venues, leading seminars or speaking from the front. I know that he's been somebody that I suppose in many ways different paths have crossed in terms of how we are trying to do ministry, which is what we're doing for the Lord. Wherever it is, ministry isn't necessarily leading a church. It's helping people to find God and then come into the life that He's got for us. And I know a little bit about the background of Patrick, and some of you probably will already know. I mean, he's got an OBE. That's from the work that he's done over the years. He was involved in helping with down in London and beyond with knife crime. That there was lots of sort of helping with young disaffected people, being able to help them. Then he founded Kintsugi Hope, I think, together with his wife, which has helped tens of thousands of people across the UK to find help and hope in these honest groups where people can, just express that being a human is messy and complicated and difficult at times, and that we all kind of need relationship and one another to be able to get the hope and the help that we need and the healing. And through a mutual friend, I got to hear about how Patrick has now stepped into a new chapter through brighterdays.life, which is looking about the whole well-being idea. Of course, we've looked at that here previously about well-being being shalom. But what does that look like? Because if you're going into non-Christian organizations and say we're here for shalom, they're going to wonder what you are. But people, like the idea of well-being, and understand that for organizations and communities and leadership too. So I'm getting to know Patrick, and I'm very grateful that he's here on the show. I'm looking to unpack something of his early life and how that formed him, because obviously for all of us, our background story is going to inform how we see ourselves and the things that we're dealing with and how we deal with them. And then to founding a national charity, difficult decisions to step away and start something again. And then he's done that once, I think, and now he's doing it again. And so, how does this look in real life? And so I'm delighted that he's come along here. I'm interested to look at the journey behind the story. So, Patrick, thanks so much for joining us. I hope that intro kind of, I didn't miss anything major out of that. That there was, anything that you think, he didn't say about that.
No, that's all good. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. What's obviously I was talking before about this background, which is always, it seems to me, the way God's wired you is to get something of His heart for people that maybe haven't, my background is, brought up in a working class council estate, but with mum and dad who loved me to bits, gave me the best that they could give me, and that kind of stable background and as a family, etc. Which then from there to go into the police, and really it was only when I was in the police in some ways that I got confronted with a number of realities that other people, we all play the cards we've been dealt, but in the end, not everybody got the same chances as I did, etc. So what got you into this? What's the story, your backstory, I suppose?
Yeah, I think one of the probably pivotal moments for me was when I was 16, I went to do a 2-week mission trip, if you like, but in London. And we went to a place called Cardboard City, which in those days was underneath the Royal Festival Hall.
Mm.
And there were literally hundreds and hundreds of homeless people there. And it was sort of the contrast, because to go to the Royal Festival Hall, you had to walk right through the middle of Cardboard City. So you'd have these people, dressed up really nicely for the theatre. And then you had extreme poverty. And I think I'd never seen poverty quite like that before. And I remember he sat round on the floor with there was probably about 8 homeless guys there, and one person had begged enough money to buy a hamburger, and they took a bite of the hamburger, and then they passed it to their friend who took a bite, and then they passed it right around this circle, and then they offered me a piece as well. And I remember thinking, wow, this is crazy. I have relatively most things I need. You have nothing, and yet you're still sharing out of your poverty. And I remember looking up at the walls of Kabul City, and someone with big red paint had written the words on the wall, "Welcome to reality."
Mm.
And I think, I grew up in a Christian home and, went to youth group, went to church, but I felt like I'd lived a little bit in this Christian bubble, if I'm honest. And I felt like at that moment, my Christian bubble burst,
Mm.
and I remember going back, and it was one of those trips, where you all sleep on air beds. And I remember praying, God, please give me your heart for the marginalized and the broken and the last, the lost and the least. And I remember also thinking, I'd always struggled with the whole suffering question, around why is there suffering? And I realized that when I interacted with people who were really suffering, they had a faith, and they were like, I can't do this without my faith, Patrick. And there was something just so, I don't know, rich about them and beautiful about their faith that I felt like has so much authenticity about it that I want to dedicate my life to go into those on the margins, and that's what I've tried to do over this sort of last 51 years.
Yeah, it's interesting because you remind me very much of a friend of mine called Sarah de Cavallo, who founded a couple of charities, but she's been at the forefront for many years of things around human trafficking. I remember talking to her. I don't know if it was the same place, but she had a moment like that. I think the same way. She was in London working for the BBC, had all kinds of prospects ahead of her, but then went into it, was like walking past the need, the opportunity every day. And then eventually just dared to pray well, God, do you want me to do anything about this kind of a prayer? And that then took her to the favelas of Brazil, first of all. And,
Wow.
and she lived out there for years. Now she does amazing. I'll have to get her on a podcast too at some point. She's brilliant.
Yeah, sounds amazing.
But it's that, I mean, interested in, so this isn't to big you up, but I will be, effectively, it's hard to, you did something. You've done some things. Many of us might see that, feel that, have a heart for it, but then just go back to, well, I'm going to be a good Christian and go to church then, and maybe I'll, once I've got everything I need, I might give some money towards supporting some people who go and do that. It's a risky kind of a prayer that you prayed, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you know God was actually calling you to do it rather than support somebody who might go and, we can always think, well, there's some specialist people who are doing that kind of thing, so I can support them. How do you know he means you?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know if I knew, like, I was 16, and I remember coming home to my home church, and I went up to the pastor, and it's James 2:17 that says, faith without action is dead. And I was like, I feel like we should be doing so much more in our community. And I'll never forget, he said to me, do you know what? If you want to do more in terms of evangelism in this church, I will pray for you and support you, but I want you to lead it. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm 16. What are you talking about? Maybe he's got a bit old and he don't fancy it, and so we did. We started this non-alcoholic cocktail bar. We started reaching out into hospitals, into the town centre, doing detached youth work. And and it was an amazing time, and it galvanized our youth group like you wouldn't believe.
Mm.
And I think there is something, isn't there? Like anything, like once to grow in anything, you've got to put it into action. And faith for me became really real because I was starting to, it wasn't like a comfort blanket. It was something that I really needed it to be able to get out of my comfort zone and into the communities that I wanted to serve. And when I was 18, I was desperate to get back to London, and I wanted to get back to London, and I started doing a gap year in this church. And down the road from the church, there was a school, and they had a stabbing in the school playground. And so the school phoned the church up and said, will you help us get the moral fibre of our school up? The vicar didn't really fancy it that much, so sent me as the local sort of young youth worker. What can I do? And so I really went into the school, and I remember saying, as local church, we believe in serving our local community. What can we do to serve? What can we do to help? And I think that was important because sometimes I feel like we can arrive in places with an agenda
Mm,
and go, this is what we want to do to your young people. And it was very much, we want to try and understand. And this one school, had 65 mother tongue languages. So it wasn't that the kids were stupid. They just didn't understand what was being taught.
mm,
So we helped with literacy and numeracy, and we started doing assemblies. And I remember there was this one guy who came up to me wearing a bulletproof vest underneath his school uniform, and he said, "I'll be dead by next week." And I thought he was bragging, but actually I did all the research and the safeguarding stuff that you need to do in those situations, and he wasn't. And in fact, 6 weeks later, he got stabbed through the neck at 3:30 by a kid in year 11. He was in year 10.
mm,
So, and then there was this young lad called Damilola Taylor, who you may remember. He was 10 years old and he got stabbed to death just down the road from where we lived in Peckham in southeast London. And so I found 17 people to give me £25 a month.
mm,
And I started a charity called XLP. And XL stood for wanting kids to excel in everything they did, and P stood for project. And then we just started. We started with just me, and then now it's still going on. It's a big charity now, working right across London, doing all sorts of
mm.
things. But I think at the heart of it was really just wanting to serve our communities, wanting to understand. There's that verse I've always challenged by in Chronicles that talks about the men of Issachar understood the times and
Mm,
knew what Israel should do. And I think there's a lot around understanding always challenges our perspective. And if we want to really understand where people are at, we need to ask and we need to listen.
yeah,
And then out of that becomes relationship and compassion that moves us.
right. I'm going to cycle back on that, unpick them. So you have a leader. He didn't say his name. I don't know his name. He's not got an OBE,
No.
but him not stopping you is big, I think.
Yeah.
Even, yeah, I don't know what he said in terms of encouragement. And I say you could have taken it as well, maybe but how many of us, I'm thinking as a leader, if I get some 16-year-old kid coming up telling me we should be doing more, I was just going to receive that as criticism because I've got such a thin skin that, well, we're doing this and we're doing that. And, get back to your table tennis. What do we entrust the young people with? It's
Yeah.
massive. It's like, well, you could do, if you're really good, you could do the coffee and we might put you in charge of the tuck shop. So there's something there. So you were effectively believed in enough, at least to be able to say, we're not going to stop you. And that's leadership, I think. I mean, I say sometimes just creating a permission giving atmosphere effectively for people to go and have a go. So that's what happened. And then that was, instrumental, having somebody believing us when we're young. But then, going back over what you've done in terms of, I'm always just trying to unpick what the leadership lessons are for myself here. You've got going in and listening and finding out what the actual problems are. Because it could have been that you could have thought, or I could have thought, even with my police background now, we need to go in and actually address that knife crime stuff and talk
Yeah.
about the danger of knives and, I don't know, do self-defense classes or
Yeah.
whatever, or started a boxing gym, or could have gone in with all kinds of different ideas of what was needed. But in the end, what came out was the trust that young person had to come up to you and talk to you about why he was wearing that vest.
Yeah.
Came from you'd gone in and listened and were helping with what their actual perceived need was.
Yeah, I think you're so right, Anthony. I think the interesting thing about when I went up to my church leader and my youth leader and talked to that, his name is Malcolm Barkway, and I still know him today. And I always say to people, you know what, XLP's been a hugely influential charity. So is Kintsugi Hope and all. None of that would probably exist if it wasn't for this guy,
Mm,
who now is retired. And interestingly enough, he went and lived overseas. He worked in the prison service for a while, and now he's come back. He often drives me to places because he's like, I'm retired, and we hang out loads now. So
amazing.
we've gone full circle, and we're very
Mm,
close. We're probably closer than we've ever been, and
mm,
we see each other all the time. And I say that it's because of his belief and allowing me to make mistakes as well,
mm,
because I feel like sometimes, we let people do something and then they make the mistake and then that's it. That's their one chance. And they've blown it. And I think the grace he had for me, but also he didn't just leave me out there to do it on my own.
mm.
He took a back seat, but we met and prayed every couple of weeks.
Wow.
and went into his office, and sometimes he'd be there when we were doing a cocktail bar, and sometimes he wouldn't be. But yeah, he was pivotal in that journey, really. And I think he really did, like say, for me now with other people that I lead, I think back and I think, oh my goodness, I want to be that person. And I think it goes against our little wanted to be in control of everything, because I think
Mm,
that's a natural thing often for leaders is like, how do I control this and how can I? And actually, it's scary when you're not in control.
mm,
And I think but looking back, it was pivotal,
yeah,
definitely
that's good.
pivotal.
So a language I've got here at Ivy around something similar for that, because obviously, hopefully, if you're creating faith and speaking to people and telling them that you can change the world for Jesus, not just that you can change your life, but there's future impacts for the kingdom for you, then you're going to get people coming up with ideas. But one thing I've done to kind of filter that over the years here is say have a kind of our thing and your thing conversation where I said that sounds great. It sounds like God really speaks to you about something. For now, that sounds like your thing, and we're going to help you do your thing for God. It's probably not going to be an hour thing. Yeah, but we're with you and behind you. Unless it's something, because often people come up with an idea of, like, we should start anew, we should do this, we should do that. And actually,
Yeah,
the danger as a leader, church leader, is I can feel, oh, you want more from me.
yeah,
And then I've already got enough on my plate.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
that's just, I'm offering this to leaders who are listening as as a bit of a potential framework. Sounds like he kind of did a hybrid because he helped your
yeah,
thing, but he became
yeah,
part of your thing by being along and
yeah,
interested. He didn't just sort of totally leave you to it.
yeah, 100%. And I think that's part of, the culture you're trying to breed, isn't it? I always think of culture as the way we do things around here.
Mm,
And I think to have a healthy culture means that you want to be able people to grow in the gifting that they have. And sometimes that will be taking a supportive. And sometimes there'll be a point where, I often think when the relay runners, there's a hand the baton over, there's
mm,
a running alongside moment. And they run alongside and then the
mm,
other person,
mm,
and there's that moment as well. And I think it's for leaders, it's just discerning how that happens,
mm,
and allowing, another leader for me, I remember when I moved to Peckham, one of the things I didn't know lots about was Black history. It wasn't
mm.
taught particularly well in school. I think I had a couple of lessons about Martin Luther King and the slave trade, but I didn't really understand it. So I got to know a guy called Les Isaac,
Yeah.
who was the founder of Street Pastors. And he was fascinating. So he said to me, well, what you really need to do is come to the Caribbean. And so I didn't want to argue with that. I felt that was definitely a word from the Lord, and suffer for Jesus in the Caribbean with Les. That sounded great.
Mm,
But the place he wanted to take me was Trenchtown in Jamaica, where Bob Marley grew up,
mm,
and Trenchtown, I've been there many times now. I love it, but it's a place torn apart by gang violence.
mm,
I
mm,
remember in June, there were 600, from January to June, there were 600 people shot.
mm,
I remember going down this one particular alley, which they call Bullet Alley, and they said, oh, in this house, which has bullet holes all over it, there was a 15-year-old girl who was 38 weeks pregnant, and she had 3-year-old twins, and gunmen came in and killed all three of them.
mm,
And then the gang said, for everyone you've killed, we're going to go and kill 5 of yours. And when we arrived, it was tense. There'd been
mm,
a shooting the night before. The atmosphere. I've been to a few countries where you feel like, my goodness, it could kick off any moment now. And so what we decided to do, we met this wonderful lady who runs a school right in the heart of Trenchtown called Miss Lorna. And she's quite a character, which is often is in these situations. And she built this school and she felt God called her to do it. And she started with clipboards as desks and building blocks
mm,
as chairs. And she said, one day, Patrick, gunmen come to me and put guns to my head and said, give me money and I'll protect you. And she says, being the God-fearing woman she is, she said, I looked gunmen in the face. I said, who do you think you are, Jesus? I was like, you're my new best friend. Please don't leave me. And she was like, you know what we should do is we should do a rap session. And I was like, I don't really understand what that means. She goes, it means when we get all the gang leaders together and you mediate between them. And I'm thinking to myself, do I want to get the gang leaders together and mediate between them? Not really. And some of these guys have serious names. I remember I met a guy called Sledge and another guy called Slaughter. So you can imagine how my poor wife was in England, how's Jamaica? Yeah, it's cool. I'm just hanging out with Sledge and Slaughter. They send their love. But we did this rap session, and again, I took exactly the same approach as I took all those years ago when I started XLP, of going, guys, I don't get it. I don't understand all the violence. I don't understand all the different things that are going on.
Mm,
It's hard for me to get my head round.
mm,
And we had a discussion and a conversation. And then that night we did this peace concert, and I'll never forget it. It was one of the pivotal moments of my life. There was this big road that goes through Trenchtown called Colorsmith Drive. And we put a stage up in the middle. So one side of the community doesn't walk to the other side of the community. And so the stage in the middle meant that both sides could watch. And I remember that there were lots of people there. And I was thinking, wow, this is incredible. There were women there not wearing many clothes, because by not wearing many clothes, they were like, please look at me and tell me I'm valuable,
mm,
sir. Kids, every night kids hear gunshots. Gunmen at the side, guns down the front of their trousers.
mm,
And there was music and stuff. And then Les turns to me and he says, go on then. And I was like, what do you mean, go on then? Go on then.
mm,
And he went, and then he said this. He went, they're all waiting to see what the white boys got to say.
mm, mm,
And I was like, what do you mean? And then he said, you white boys, you don't come to places like this. You go to your nice conference centers and your Christian festivals.
mm,
They've worked out you're not police. They think you're probably charity guy,
mm,
but they're all fascinated why the white boys come to Trenchtown. So you better get up there and speak.
mm.
And I remember being so challenged by that.
Yeah, yeah,
What does it look like to go to places which sometimes may make us feel uncomfortable, to go to people where they're at and address some of those issues that people are
yeah.
facing in their lives? And that was probably one of the most memorable. And I think what Les did for me,
Mm,
and he's done it many times actually over the years, he created space.
mm, mm.
He created space, but he didn't abandon me. I knew he was there and he was cheering me on. And again, Malcolm and Les, and there's been a few others I think I owe a lot to,
Yeah,
and they will be lifelong friends.
yeah, brilliant. Welcome to reality.
Yeah.
Another one of those moments. So as you're listening, I'm having flashbacks, kind of my last 3 years in the police here in Manchester, like plain clothes, and it was all to do with gangs, with guns, mostly in a place called Cheetham Hill in Manchester, which was, you've got Cheetham Hill and Moss Side are the two well-known ones, and gangs, etc. So I was plain clothes. I was totally in enforcement mode. I never saw those people as redeemable. I'm a Christian at this point. I became a Christian while I was in the police. But as far as I'm concerned, literally I would go, do the job, try to detect the crime, try to prevent the crime, try to prosecute the offenders, try to do everything that I could. And then I would finish and I would drive out to the suburbs where I then lived and worship Jesus and have my family life out here doing that. And then I made it. I ended up getting called into the Anglican ministry, but I never thought I would end up going to those kind of people. I didn't see that the gospel effectively, that I had been given would work there. It was like, I wouldn't have even thought of how to do that. And I connected him with the message early on, became friends with Andy Hawthorne, etc., and saw what they were doing, got them in the school near us. But it was, I'm just to try to process as you're saying it, that thing of, it took a long time for me to start to see that actually how could the church engage with the realities of something, of those kind of realities, rather
Yeah.
than box it off as a
Yeah.
social problem. That again,
Yeah.
we could be praying about it. We can hope that the police and the government and other people get involved and help to sort it. Rather, we've actually, the church has I think the church has, as you say, effectively stepped back and away from some of these things. But God's called
Yeah.
you to step in
Yeah.
and to do that.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, because I think for me, there was a big shift in the way I viewed like mission, I guess, and charity.
Mm,
Is I felt like there's a big difference between charity and justice. And I think sometimes with charity, it's almost like we tick the charity box. So it becomes about them and us.
mm,
It's almost like we download the single, that's our charity box done, the anti-knife crime single.
yeah.
And we give to food bank. All these things are okay to do, but there's a sense that justice is such at the heart of the gospel.
Mm.
and who Jesus was. Connor West said he talked about justice being what love looks like in public. I love that, and I felt
Mm.
like the whole knife crime and gang crime thing for me was around realizing that I was living in this community, and that means there is no them and us. It's just us.
Mm.
We're all part of the same community. I am not here to come and rescue you.
Mm.
I'm here because I'm part of this community. And I remember sitting in a police station with a friend of mine who was a borough commander, and he'd written down he put there'd been a murder, and he'd written down on a piece of paper. He drew a picture of a knife crime suspect, and he wrote down on one side of the paper all the things that are present in this knife crime suspect's life.
Mm.
Domestic violence, drug abuse, gaming, poverty, educational failure. And then on the other side, he wrote down everything that was absence from
Mm.
this potential suspect: a
Mm.
father,
Mhm.
love,
Mm.
community.
Mm.
And I just felt God just breaks your heart, and I felt like when Jesus did anything and that was successful, it was out of compassion. Out of compassion, he healed the person with leprosy. Out of compassion, he healed the blind man. Matthew, where he talks about the sheep being harassed and helpless, the crowds being like harassed and helpless, like a sheep without a shepherd. It says, filled with compassion,
Mm.
he reached out and touched them. And I realized that had to be my motivation, because within my own resources, I'm not compassionate.
Mm.
I'm selfish sometimes, but the compassion of God compels me to try and make a difference. And it's really interesting. One of the things that me and this borough commander did is we got a police riot van. We bought it off the police for £1, and we approached MTV and we said to them, if you turn this into a mobile recording studio, they had this program called Pimp My Ride,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah.
when they took this old clapped out vehicle and returned it into something ridiculous and said, would you turn it into a mobile recording studio and give it to me? That was our pitch.
Mhm.
It cost nearly 100 grand or something, and they did, and it became the most watched program on MTV that year, beat the European awards,
Wow.
and then again, it was a point there we were going and we were working with young people and working and seeing, and some of the most damaged young people that you would ever meet.
Mm.
The stories were horrendous,
Yeah.
absolutely horrendous, and that what they'd been through. And I started to think, if I was born with different parents, different choices,
Oh, yeah.
I'm 2 or 3 choices away from where they are.
Yeah.
And so, but I think it was that compassion that motivated me. And I think it was more from the way Jesus sees these people rather than the way I see them.
Proximity, isn't it? I mean, that's one of the Eden stuff so Steve and
Yeah.
Sarah Small, who lead Eden, come to Ivy, and their
Oh, great.
conference is proximity, and it is that thing of not just being away from things, but close. So again, as you're saying it, what started to change in me a little bit, there was the Strange Ways riot happened near
Oh,
the
yeah.
end of my time in the police. And so you got loads of overtime, and the police
Yeah.
stations became prisons. So I ended up unwillingly, effectively, as a prison warden for the last 18 months in the police as I was leaving to go to the Theological. And then, because you're in there, you get chatting to them.
Yeah.
And it's like any kind of missionary endeavor starts with actually connecting with people. Like you say, then you get to hear the stories and why some of them don't want to leave. They're like,
Yeah.
I'm happy in here because
Yeah.
what I'm
Safe.
going to go back to is just such
Yeah.
carnage.
Yeah.
And because I'd be like thinking, this must be awful. I'd feeling claustrophobic stuck in these things for 10 hours. So my reality and their reality is so different. Great. So what, in all of that then, how was your Christianity, your church, for better or for worse, your approach to all of this? What, you talked about, about what Jesus would be doing. And yeah, tell me a little bit about the kind of the theological emphasis, the stuff that you've sort of thought, well, this is what God's saying to me about this.
Yeah, I think around that time particularly, I was involved in a church plant on an estate, which was great fun. I mean, heartbreaking, but great fun as well, being able to do that. But I think for me, it was that Isaiah 58 was such a pivotal part of, restoration, restore the streets with dwellings and rebuilding the ancient ruins. And of course, it's all about the people returning from exile and getting back to Jerusalem and thinking, hey, we're back. And then actually hang on a minute, I don't think God's listening, and I don't think he's paying attention. What about our great worship songs, and what are great our great meetings? And then this sense of like God just speaking, that's not the type of fasting I'm after.
Mm,
And I want you to break the chains of injustice. And I felt like that was a really pivotal moment. I think another really pivotal moment for me theologically was I remember reading around a lot of the sort of, I guess, a lot of the Tom Wright stuff, but not
mm,
exclusively Tom Wright. There was another guy called Tom Sine. I don't know if you
yeah.
remember Tom Sine. He wrote a book called Mustard Seed
Mm,
versus Mac Weld.
mhm,
And the whole thing was obviously mustard seed being the kingdom of God and how it grows. Sometimes it's hidden, it grows in relation. And Macwell being the McDonald's, it's got to be fast, it's got to be quick.
mhm,
And within that book, and he sort of did it a bit before Tom Wright did so much of his stuff around a new heaven and a new earth. And
mm,
what does it look like? And this whole idea is we're not here just to get our butts into heaven. We're not here just to escape this evil world. And then
mhm,
when we do, God will kick it into touch and go, heaven, we're going to sing a lot and have quiche and it's all going to be really good. And I just thought, God's ultimate intentions for human history are his intentions for us now. So that sense of life before death, not just life after death, and
mm,
what does that look like now? And then that concept of partnering with God rather than just letting God use you.
mm,
If
mm.
you let God use you, it feels quite. If you say I want to use you, Anthony, it feels quite negative. Like if you use anyone, it
Nobody
feels
really wants to be
negative.
used. Yeah.
No one wants to be used. No. But partner with, that feels like relationship and connection. And so I guess I went through a theological shift, whereas I think growing up, I grew up in a church that we were very much about scaring people about hell. And I felt like it was a shift around inspiring people about relationship
Mm,
and in the here and now, that God's not given up and nothing is wasted in his sort of restoration and restore the streets of dwellings.
yeah, good. And then, so you started restoring the streets of dwellings by, again, helping and starting some things that have done that in some of these tough places. And
Yeah.
then there comes a shift at some point to, I suppose, the restoration within. And I felt an emphasis on kind of helping people with mental health issues or
Yeah.
whatever. I don't know what the language is. I probably completely get that wrong.
No.
People who have struggled. We all have struggles, but particularly around that. So, what started to kind of where was the journey out of XLP through
Yeah.
that and into the next stage, which is Kintsugi Hope? Because I remember hearing about it at the time that Patrick Regan stopped doing this thing. He's starting this new thing. It's like, oh.
Yeah.
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 So, obviously you're living in it. What was the story behind that?
Yeah, it was a long journey. And I think I was the classic leader where I burnt down candle at two ends. And I was very motivated but I was slowly burning out. And, I think I often say to people, my phone here works as well on 10% as it does 100%. There's nothing this phone can't do on 10% that it can do on 100%.
Mm,
And a lot of us, what we do is we live on 10% and we're self-aware. We think I'm shattered. I'm going to plug in, and we get up to 20% and then off we go again.
mm,
And actually you could do that for years, but ultimately it's not sustainable.
mm,
And I had no knowledge around mental health. I saw it in the kids that I was working with, but my mental health started to deteriorate and I started to really struggle. And then I went through one of those moments. I describe it as the Tetris moment. I don't know if you remember the game Tetris,
mm,
the computer game.
mm,
It's where all these blocks, they fall out of the sky and they're different shapes and you're trying to get them in a straight line and you're banging your computer and
mm, mm,
you manage to get one line and the line disappears, but the idea of the game is they get faster and faster, and eventually you just can't get it all lined up.
mm,
And I'm like, God, I can't do this anymore. I've got funding issues, I've got staffing issues, I've got kids issues, you know, uh, it's just too much. And I started to unravel, and then I felt like it hit my personal life. My dad got cancer, got very, very ill, was in hospital for 8 weeks. Nearly died. We lost a baby for a miscarriage.
mm,
My two daughters got seriously ill.
mm,
One got diagnosed with some additional needs, which she has today. Another one got a condition called HSP, which is scary. And then, this is all going on, I had some knee pain and I went to the hospital and they went, I'm really sorry, Mr. Regan, because I thought it would just be a little keyhole surgery in and out in a day. We're going to have to break both your legs in 3 places and we're going to put an external frame drilled into your bones.
oh, man.
which will be on for about 6 months, and you will have to clean it every day because there'll be massive risk of infection. And we're going to
I'd be like that, but I think you've got the wrong person's notes there.
honestly, someone said to me, Anthony, they said to me, it's like waiting for a car accident to happen. You know, something really
Yeah.
awful is going to happen, but you get to
Wow.
choose when it is.
Oh,
And the fact they had to do both legs separately, like I just couldn't get it over and done with, you know.
it's terrible.
And I thought, and at the time, I remember my show reel looked really good. I was in and out of number 10 Downing Street. I was working on policy stuff. We'd had a visit from Prince William and Catherine twice in a year with the world's media,
Mm,
you know, advising prime ministers on the telephone. I mean, it was crazy. My show reel looked great. And yet behind the scenes, I was just falling apart. And when I was falling apart, that's when the image of Kintsugi, I came across it, and this
mm,
sense of being broken, and the pot that you can either mend with super glue, which a lot of people do. And in Japan, they put gold powder in the glue. So instead of hiding the cracks, they make a feature the cracks, and it becomes something different. It's the same, but it's different. It's restored to something beautiful and unique. There's nothing like it on
mm,
planet Earth. And I think through that period, God taught me so much around mental health, shalom, talked a lot to me around some of the really unhelpful coping mechanisms I've picked up over the years, some of the really poor theology that I'd believed. And then out of that experience, really, we formed the charity called Kintsugi Hope, which grew very
mm,
quickly. It was a year before the pandemic we started. And of course, when the pandemic hit, everyone was like, we need something to help people's mental health. And it was almost like, and some big churches like, we're going to have to write our own course now. And we were like, well, we did it a year ago. We didn't know
mm,
this was coming, but it's here now.
mm.
And so it grew by 455% in a year.
Wow.
And obviously it's helped, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of people.
So, if somebody now is listening and watching and not aware of what that is, how's it actually running on the ground now in different places and churches,
Yeah,
etc.?
so what we did is we wrote a wellbeing course, which is loosely based on Alcoholics Anonymous. And we did a 12-week course, and we wrote it in learning styles because we were really conscious that what might work in Peckham,
Mm,
where we were living, where there's 65 mother tongue languages, may be very different to a rural village. Issues, you know, mental health affects everyone, you know, and,
mm.
and one of my big learning points was mental health and mental illness are
Right.
really different.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
I don't have perfect vision, so I have glasses. I don't have perfect physical health. I can't run because of my knee operations.
Mm,
But that's different to physical illness. And I think it's the same with mental health. I think people get the two confused.
mm,
And so
mm,
this was
mm.
really about going, we want to invest in your mental health, a bit like you'd go to the gym or you'd watch what you eat. What can we do to be mentally fit?
Yeah.
And so we wrote it in learning styles, and then we trained churches across the UK online to deliver it in their communities. And, you know, and the fascinating thing, it became really missional because doctors' surgeries were going, we could socially prescribe to this because we're inundated here.
Mhm.
We had schools asking to do it, football clubs asking to do it. And yeah, so it really took off. And all it was really was a 12-week well-being course.
Fantastic.
But of course, what it gave people was connection. And I think if you're struggling, sometimes you don't want to be fixed, you just want to be loved. And I was like, that's where the church can come in. You know, I used to say to politicians, we're in every community across this country. And with all due respect, we're going to be here in longer than 5 years
Mm.
because we're committed. And so I think it's a beautiful thing for the church to be involved in.
Yeah, and I think the 12 steps thing, you know, as you were saying, that framework, that for a long time here at Ivy, we had uh, a kind of a recovery group, and
Hmm.
I used to love going in and into that and sitting in
Yeah.
with the guys in there and basically talking about, you know, I wasn't ever going in as a sign of I'm all sorted and it's, you know, I wasn't running it, but I'd sometimes just sit in and make sure that I was kind of sharing my own struggle, which probably, I mean, I would say in there would have been, you know, from my background and certainly for quite a long time, my coping mechanism would have been alcohol. And that was something that I was getting into as, you know, very socially acceptable, especially when I was leading the church in
Yeah.
Surrey, that you would quite easily, you know, but you're down in an awful lot of wine and finishing it off with the whiskey at night and
Yeah.
every night having a glass or two and all of that. That was but you know, I could handle it. And then, you know, but I mean, I don't drink anymore, but I would go in there and sit in there and I loved the honesty, which is so actually so often not apparent in churches because we're really good at well, hiding the cracks, or we think we are, until it all falls apart. And
Yeah.
leaders probably among the worst of that, because there's an expectation from people that you're going to be okay. I remember when I first came to Ivy, and I've written a book called The Best Marriage, and my wife said it's a pretty good book, so that's the recommendation for it. But I said in there, I remember when I first came, I talked about a time where I hadn't spoken to my wife for many days. She'd not spoken to me. We're in a really rough time. This was early on in our ministry life. And then finally we stopped on the stairs. I looked at her and said, I can't see one thing I like about you. And she said, ditto. And that was it.
Wow.
And then I said, but then we went after that. We said, we need to get some counselling. And even if it was only for the sake of the kids, that's a good reason.
Yeah.
They're a great reason to go through it. And so we did. I just kind of threw this out in the talk. And literally at the end of it, I have so many people in tears saying, we've never heard a leader admit to ever having had a problem before.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and it gave freedom
Yeah.
for people to be able to say, this sucks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to me. And I
Yeah.
think that, in terms of what we're looking at now going forward, again, I think that you've obviously made another transition now, and I'd like to talk about that. But I think with this, so what I'm seeing with this sort of, whatever they want to call it, quiet revival awakening, young people, 18 to 24, I think going through some stuff, trying to figure out faith and increasingly coming to churches. I think they're going to look for a church that's a bit more real.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that is definitely about Generation Z, which is predominantly that generation that are coming, is the thing they value the most is authenticity. And you're right. I think that we need to have cultures of courage and vulnerability. Brené Brown stuff is very good on this. And that the Latin word for courage is cur. It means to speak your mind with your heart, to show up and let your true self be seen. And of course, we've always been a little bit guilty, and particularly Christian organizations, we always want to communicate the show reel. I often think of that letter Paul wrote, is like, oh, I've been shipwrecked, I've been beaten, I've been like, it wasn't exactly like the show reel. Like, it was a complete disaster.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And he starts with like, I don't want you to be ill-informed, brothers. Like, I don't want you to think that this is all going incredibly well.
Wow, yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, it's just beautiful. It's like, oh, that's okay then. It's okay that
Yeah.
everything isn't like, and I think like we haven't modeled that sometimes. But when you do, you're right in the sense that honesty breeds more honesty, and it gives people permission. I wrote a book called Honesty Over Silence.
Yeah.
And it's okay not to be okay. And again, sometimes you're speaking and you can see people just having that Me Too moment, One of the things I felt was really interesting for me was I talked a lot about anxiety, and a bit of a pivotal moment is when I realized that anxiety wasn't weakness, that often anxiety comes from a place. I found this beautiful definition by Kirsty Cawley that talks about anxiety is often caring too much. And I really love that. I think it's because I really care. I really care about others, really hopefully care about stuff that's going on in the world. But sometimes that can tip over, a bit like a smoke alarm. If it's going off all the time, it's annoying for you and for everyone else. But it has a really important function. And so I was like, how do we communicate where we're not guilt tripping people into not having enough faith and and telling them they've got hidden sin in their life because things aren't working out, actually help them manage some of those life's challenges, because often it's not coming from an evil place. It's not coming from a bad place. It's coming from a place of wanting to care. And we need to create that culture again, going back to what we were talking about as culture.
Yeah. What are some of the worst things we can do? I think in that setting, that's gonna. I mean, you talked about effectively making people feel guilty or shamed for not having it all together. What are even around the language? I'm helpful. You helped me already with some language around. I was talk about mental health and mental illness, and etc. But what else can we do as churches that actually let's try and do less of that before we then start saying let's do more of this?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's trying to avoid the platitudes. One that always got me was like, God will not give you more than you can handle, which is actually misquoting a verse in Corinthians that's about temptation. And it doesn't really make you feel like God's a very loving God, or
Mm,
maybe there's a hidden sin in your life. I remember at the time when someone said that to me, I repented of every sin I've ever done. I even made some up just to be sure. You don't have enough faith.
mm,
It's the devil. And, I just feel like it's around really being wise and kind. And
mm,
one of the things I often reflect on when I'm preaching is Jesus on the road to Emmaus. And I think it's fascinating that the day after Jesus' resurrection, if a marketing person had come up to Jesus at that point, he probably would have said, if we could do another Sermon on the Mount or a feeding of the 5,000, let's get the word out.
mhm.
But the day after he walks alongside two heartbroken people who are struggling with grief.
Wow, yeah. So good.
And he just walks alongside for a
Mm,
half a day.
mm,
And
mm.
even then, at the start of the conversation, he doesn't offer them platitudes, or he doesn't interrupt them even and say, guys, I'm Jesus. It's all okay. We don't need to have this conversation anymore. All the stuff we've talked
Ta-da!
about. Yeah. Da-da, look at me. He he tells a bigger story. He
Yeah.
he actually starts from, talking about the prophets and Moses, and he tells this bigger story of God involved in history. And then he gets to Emmaus. And the interesting thing, I've never quite worked this out. It says he was going to go on, and they persuade him to stay. And I'm like, the big reveal hasn't happened yet. Why are you going to go on and leave them?
Mm,
And then obviously he breaks, and the brokenness reveals who Jesus is. And I think that walking alongside and not getting stressed about having all the answers. And I think sometimes we feel like we have to be experts, but actually, you do what you can do. I've just written a book called Small Steps for Big Change.
mhm.
And one of the fascinating things about the research doing this book was saying that a lot of us, we're living in constant fear of failure. We're living in that constant fight, flight, or freeze mode.
Yeah.
And what it's saying is the research says that when you make your steps really small,
Mhm.
there's a part of our brain called the amygdala,
Mm,
which is the fight or flight or
mhm.
freeze sensor, and it goes off, because we're looking for threat, we're looking
Mm,
for social validation, and it says, but if you can make the choice quite small, you can tiptoe around it, and you
mm.
don't sell it off. And I think sometimes it's just that, just be alongside people.
Yeah.
Just be alongside. Go to the doctors with them. Go for a coffee. Show some kindness. Kindness is about the best thing we can do for our mental health.
Mm.
Kindness to others, kindness to ourselves.
Well, good.
Whoever invented kindness is a genius. That's what I say.
Yeah, and I'd like to meet that guy. So now this new chapter, Brighter Days, what is it that you're doing there? What's the kind of problem, if you like, you're trying to, I'm not, problem you're solving, probably not going to solve it, but what's the thing that you're trying to do that's different now from what you've been in the past?
Yeah, so Brighter Days really came out of, I was sitting in my office a while ago, and like most Christian leaders, I have hundreds of Christian books. You can see some of them behind me probably, and there you go. And I suddenly thought to myself, wow, I don't have one book out of all my books that I would give to one of the dads that I watch football with, or one of the mums at the school gate. I have some evangelistic books, but they're really in your face.
Mm,
And I also, when I had like this breakdown experience, with my Tetris moment, everyone was trying to give me a book to read, and I couldn't even read a paragraph, not alone a book.
mm,
So I was like, what would it look like to write something which actually deals with emotional and mental health, but doesn't leave out spiritual health like most wellbeing books do?
mm,
And still talked about that, but did it in a way that was hopefully kind and gentle.
mm,
And so I wrote a book called Brighter Days, wrote it in really short stories. And then I felt really challenged to go, what would it look like to do and speak about the contents of this book, but not just within the Christian bubble?
mm,
I'd love to get to see more non-Christians. So we started a little company, a little business, and we started going into prisons, and we started doing meet the author sessions.
mm.
And so the prison, like I just took an order for 400 books yesterday, and the prisoners were loving it. They were
Mm,
loving it. And Nina Hussain, who she reads ITV News, she's a
mm.
very good friend of mine. We were neighbours for years. She loves it as well. So she comes in and she interviews me about the themes of the book.
Nice.
The guys, they get a book afterwards, and we sign it, and we chat, and
Mm,
we return. And then we started going into workplaces, and one school rang me up and said, could I have 150 copies, please? And I was like, why? And they went, we've had 3 attempted overdoses in year 11, but it's actually the parents we're worried about, because How did your parents talk to you about mental health? How did my
Wow.
parents? It was non-existent or sketchy.
Mm,
So parents are struggling. So they said, we'll get you in to speak to the whole of Year 11 and the whole of Year 11's parents, and we'll
amazing.
disguise it as an awards evening. So we did that. Lloyd's Bank, they were talking about staff retention, and they said to me, we need to keep our staff, let's address the issue of well-being. And I noticed that when I started talking about spiritual well-being, is they didn't seem to have a problem with that.
Mm,
And I could start talking and unpacking what that means for me, because it would mean different things for different people. And I just found that God started to open up opportunities in the NHS, in business, in criminal justice, in education. And,
amazing.
and so I got some of the talks I present accredited by CPD, Continuous Professional Development. So there's an accreditation.
Mm,
And then, there's a few of us now just going into places. And so I probably spend about 60% of my time outside of the Christian bubble, and then 40% still in church. And why I still love going to church is because there are people sitting there in church going, "Oh, I've never thought of inviting someone into my workplace before.
mm,
And this could work," and when we do go into their workplaces and it goes well, they're so excited because they get the conversations that then happen afterwards,
oh, brilliant.
about a bigger story and redemption and how you handle grief and perfectionism. And so, yeah, so we've sort of started along that path now, and just seeing what God opens up. And it has to be him, because we have no marketing budget whatsoever. So, and it's very relational. Yeah, it's very relational.
Love it. Yeah, and like you say, I think people are. It's a good way in. So if anybody checks it out, if you've not done it already, we have a thing called ladybridgeconnect.org, and that's one of the places that we meet in. And we bought a cricket and lacrosse club off the council, and transformed this horrible, stinking drinking hole into a great site for community, together with the sports clubs to do it. But if you look on the website for that, which is our church, but it basically says this is a project for wellness,
Yeah.
physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. It's like there. And I think once people get that framework, they're a lot more open to that spiritual, because they
Yeah.
realize that actually, we can talk about all those
Makes
other
sense.
things, but,
Yeah.
and that's the drive. If people ask us, why did you as a church spend all that money on doing that project? It's like, well, God's concerned about all of it.
Yeah.
And that's a surprise to them.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think it's about joining the dots.
Mm,
When I'm doing training, I often say, well, if you're stressed, how does that affect, that you feel that very often in your mind? You've got negative thoughts, they're stressing you out. How does that affect you physically?
mm,
Well, it gives me backache. I get a sleepless night. I might more get a stomach upset. How does that affect you emotionally? I get angry. I snap more. How does that affect your behavioral health? Well, I withdraw
mm,
from situations. I don't go out as much. How does that affect your spiritual health? I feel disconnected. I don't feel connected to anything or anyone, or I don't feel like I've got a bigger meaning.
mm.
And you realize that all these things are connected, and that's what holistic health is all about. And traditionally, you may go to the doctor and bless the NHS. I mean, they're incredible, but they're often having to put out fires all the time. So it's like, we'll give you a tablet for this physical symptom,
Yeah,
which may help in the short term, but there's this massive health issue going on for you, which is more than just the physical symptom.
yeah.
And I think that's, there's a lot of research about trauma now, that says
Mm,
trauma is stored in your body.
yes.
And there's a famous book called The Body Keeps Score,
Mm,
that
mm,
it builds. So I
mm.
think people are starting to think much more holistically now about
Yeah.
health, both inside the church and outside the church. Because I think too often in the church, sometimes we're so paranoid about making sure everyone becomes a Christian that we want to talk about the other stuff. Whereas
Mm.
I actually think the kingdom of God is so big and multifaceted and multicolored. And, I think it's about all.
Absolutely love it. Fantastic. So, as we're starting to wrap up, Patrick, is there anything that you think, again, if you were in connection again just with a church leader, charity leader, somebody who at the moment, I think I'm going to hone in on that Tetris thing as you were feeling it. Maybe there's somebody who's listening or watching and that kind of resonated with
Yeah,
them. What do you, what can you do when somebody just feels like I'm like you say, fighting fires, I'm juggling
yeah.
too many things, etc. What's something they could consider or do or whatever? How do we
Yeah.
approach that?
I think I've got this little mantra now, which I try and use as much as I can. And it came out of a conversation that I had with my wife. We were having dinner one night and we were playing that game, Who's the Most Tired game, and because we don't want to clear up the dishes afterwards. And so I was trying to impress her with my exhaustion levels of, I've managed to get 5 talks this week. I got a successful funding bid in. I've taken the kids to all their activities. I even took them to the cinema, slept all the way through the film, but we won't mention that. And she just looked totally unimpressed. And I thought, what is it with this woman? I can't she's giving me nothing. And I remember she said to me, that's all well and good, but at what cost? And I was
Mm,
like, oh my goodness. And I read about this phrase called pyrrhetic victories, which
mm,
means you win the battle, but you lose the war.
mm,
King Pyritus, he was Alexander the Great's second cousin or something. Alexander the Great was his cousin. I can't remember how they were related, but he was known as this amazing leader who
mm,
would literally go and he'd win these battles, but his mental was emotional and his army's health was just deteriorated.
mm,
And eventually he just died in obscurity and that's it.
mm, mm,
I was like, I don't want to be that leader.
mm,
And so I started to think and pray about this, and I felt this little thing came to me, and it was like, start small, create some space, and think differently. And I
mhm,
was like, what does that mean? And I think start small was like, what are those small choices I need to make? Because actually, we don't tend to make sweeping change because they don't last. It's a little bit now, we're getting into February. Everyone's starting to feel guilty for all their New Year's resolutions they haven't kept because we make these massive, things. But the choices were small
yeah,
and they crept around that part of your brain that's going to set off your fight or freeze. Small acts of kindness to yourself and to others.
mm,
Creating space is an interesting one. I started to look at what does it mean to create space for simplicity? Because my life is so, someone talked to me the other day, which I found fascinating. They said, have you got enough space for the white space? And I meant, what do you mean?
mm,
And they went, well, around the words, there's lots of white space.
mhm,
But if it's all full of stuff, you've got no white space. You've got no margin whatsoever. And I thought that was a really interesting thing.
mm, mm,
Space
mm.
is like rocket fuel to the mind. It's hard to be creative without space.
Love
And
it.
then think differently was like, yeah, I'm one of those. I feel like I need to challenge, because we just accept sometimes this is the way I've always thought about theology. This is the way I've always thought about this. But can I challenge myself again to think differently, to dive into some books, to study and,
Mm,
and to
mm,
keep
keep
to
learning.
keep that part of you alive. Yeah.
Yeah,
And to keep learning. And so I'm trying to keep everything we're doing at the moment. We're going, are we starting small? Are we creating space? And are
mm,
we thinking differently? And what does that look like? So yeah, that would be
yeah,
my 3 little tips.
brilliant. Yeah, I remember hearing somebody saying that we know we're alive if you growing and giving,
Yeah.
2 things that make
Yeah.
life feel, good. So thank you for everything you shared, and thank you for what
Pleasure.
you've been giving. Would you just wrap us up in a prayer for anybody who's listening and watching
Yeah.
today, just to kind of bless them?
Yeah. Yeah, Father, thank you that you say in your word, come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. And I thank you, Lord, that is such a beautiful invitation. We don't come to you in order to feel guilty. You don't hit us over the head with why have you done this and why have you done it? You just say, come. Come to me and I will give you rest. And Father, I pray, Lord, that we would know that it is okay not to be okay. We
Mm,
would be able to know that we come to you as our authentic selves and knowing that we need you and we long for your Holy Spirit to work in our lives. And we pray, God, that as we do that, Lord, that you would just open our hearts, Lord, to what you're saying. And Lord, and to give us that sense of that we know that we belong to you and that's the most important thing is who we belong to. So thank you, Father, for this conversation. And we pray, Father, that we would know your presence with us today, whether we're in the car, listening in our kitchen or in our home, or
mm,
whether we're running out or having a run or a walk, that we would know your presence.
yeah.
And we'd know that sense of just like those guys on the Emmaus Road, that you would walk alongside
Thank you.
and we would have communion with you. Amen.